Hi friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. Today we continue our 10 Flaw series. So far we've done the Separatist battle droids, Star Destroyers, and Stormtroopers. Now I'll be taking a look at the TIE Fighter in Space Superiority Starfighter. Now it's definitely not my first choice when it comes to starfighters, but there are actually some good qualities about the TIE Fighter. For one, it's probably one of the most efficiently produced vehicles in the Star Wars galaxy. Everything from its solar panels and engines are designed with minimal moving parts, making the assembly cheaper and making the TIE Fighter more reliable and easier to build. It's also an extremely maneuverable and fast fighter. And it kind of makes sense. With millions of systems to patrol, you want to limit the cost of your main starfighter. Perhaps the price and ease of production and maintenance alone offsets any flaws I'm going to mention, but still, for the sake of fandom, we must break down and analyze this TIE Fighter. The Star Wars galaxy is home to many different civilizations that are extremely advanced and able to travel many times faster than the speed of light. But for some reason, most space combat between starfighters still take place within line of sight. We're basically talking about World War I to Korean War era type dogfighting. Now, obviously, visually, it's a lot more interesting to see starfighters going at it at close range rather than have them shoot missiles from 1,000 miles away, so we're not going to target this aspect all that much. But we do have to take into account what this style of combat means for fighter design and, more importantly, cockpit design. You see, one of the most important parts of dogfighting, whether using autocannons or a Sidewinder missile, is having visibility. Erich Hartmann, a German Luftwaffe pilot from World War II, is credited with 352 kills on the Eastern Front. That's more than 2 times the kills that American sniper Chris Kyle had during his entire service. Now sure, in the earlier years of the war, the Soviet pilots and aircraft were just terrible. Most Russian fighters lacked proper targeting sights, so pilots would just kind of draw them onto the front of their windshield. The pilots, on the other hand, were sometimes sent up with only 8 to 10 hours of flight time. But both the Soviet planes and pilots would eventually improve throughout the war, and the Reds would design some of the best planes of the war, like the Yak-3. Anyway, Hartmann flew over 1,400 sorties and was involved in aerial combat 823 times. He said he survived because of one reason. He never engaged an enemy if they saw him before he made his approach. If he was spotted, he would use his Bf-109's powerful engine to outrun enemy fighters. It was his stalking ability that allowed him to survive so many missions. He was also extremely lucky and crash-landed 14 times without dying. Although he was never under fire in any of those situations, the guy was basically a ninja. So, according to Erich Hartmann, the most important part of dogfighting is actually just seeing your enemy before he sees you. And that's why when you look at fighters like the famous P-51 Mustang evolved throughout World War II, one of the main things that really changes besides engine size and armament is the canopy structure. The P-51A goes from having almost no rear visibility to a complete bubble canopy. The same thing happened with the P-47 Thunderbolt. Now let's take a look at the TIE Fighter canopy in comparison. It's almost laughable how bad it is. Sure, you have a great large front window, but there's zero visibility to the sides and the back of the vehicle. On top of that, because of the way the wings are designed, they further block the vision of the TIE Fighter on the sides. So a TIE Fighter would be extremely easy to sneak up on, especially if its sensors were jammed or if it was involved in another dogfight. This is probably one of the worst parts about the fighter's design. The TIE Fighter had only one weapon on board, and that was the LS-1 laser cannon. These were quite potent weapons and capable of quickly stripping the shield of a similar-sized starship. It could even be used to strafe unarmored ground targets. But for anything larger than smaller unarmored targets, the TIE Fighter was more or less useless. It lacked any real anti-capital ship weapons like a proton or ion torpedo. Also, because the TIE Fighter only had line-of-sight weapons, they had to get extremely close to engage the enemy, exposing itself to danger. A quick fix would be just to put a torpedo launcher on the ship. Now, if the TIE Fighter was involved in more long-range combat using torpedoes or Separatist-style missiles, a deflector shield wouldn't really be that useful in that scenario. It's just not powerful enough to protect them from such a large explosion. Countermeasures and stealth tech are much more useful against large guided munitions, like we have here on Earth. But when the majority of the battles the TIE Fighters are engaged in are close-range knife fights using laser cannons, a deflector shield is actually the best defense, especially when you're in an environment where there's hundreds of pilots engaging each other. At this point, it's not about whether you'll get hit, but when. A stray laser glancing off your deflector shield in the middle of the battle is not really that big of a deal, but a stray laser glancing off of your windshield in the middle of a battle is a really big deal. As a matter of fact, without any shields or even armor, the transparent steel window on the front of the TIE Fighter now becomes a weak spot for micro-asteroids, space debris, even cosmetic radiation could kill you. And when you're traveling several thousands of miles per hour, it's almost impossible to see such a small piece of debris coming at you. It's almost suicide to fly without a deflector shield. Now, the TIE Fighter is designated as an in-space superiority fighter, but it's also deployed in atmosphere as well. As its name states, though, this TIE Fighter is mainly designed for spaceflight. In atmosphere, it's basically an odd-shaped box that is somehow able to power its way through every law of physics. The only reason the TIE Fighter is able to fly is because of how powerful repulsor technology is in Star Wars. But what about area resistance and gravitational propulsion? These awkwardly shaped wings give the craft terrible drag in all the wrong directions. Now, I'm not a rocket surgeon, but I feel like in real life a TIE Fighter would almost be impossible to fly and would also probably leave a very turbulent wake behind it. It's only because of advanced building materials, futuristic thrust capabilities, and inertial compensators to limit g-forces that a ship like this does not immediately go into an uncontrollable spin and rip itself apart. So if a TIE Fighter ever does lose power in atmosphere, it's basically just a flying rock. Well, actually, I think a rock would have better aerodynamic capabilities. There is one thing that saves the TIE Fighter pilot in that scenario, though. There is an ejection seat, but I'm not really sure if there's a parachute or not. So maybe that just delays the inevitable by a little bit. The giant wings on both sides of the TIE Fighter not only obstruct the view of the pilot and also make it extremely awkward to fly in atmosphere, it also serves as a giant beacon for sensors and radar. We've seen Star Wars ships use both sonar or radar style sensors to detect ships along with heat sensors. With two giant solar panels on the outside of your ship, you create two intense hotspots for people to track. When it comes to radar, however, the material that solar panels are made up of actually could absorb radar instead of reflecting it as much, making the TIE Fighter kinda stealthy. But unfortunately, the inside of the TIE Fighter wings aren't covered in solar panels and just serve as two gigantic paddles to reflect radar. So the TIE Fighter is not stealthy at all. And as we talked about before, dogfighting, especially close-range dogfighting, is all about seeing your enemy first. So having a gigantic sensor signal is not really a good idea. The Empire is really cheap, and trust me, I do get it. There's a lot of territory to cover, but there's cheap, and then there's just downright stupid. And by downright stupid, I mean including an anti-theft mechanism which allows a central control system to scuttle a TIE Fighter if someone steals it. Now, I'm not talking about something practical like a remote engine switch. The Empire's anti-theft mechanism deattaches the wings from the central pod of the TIE Fighter. So if that TIE Fighter is in atmosphere, you're basically losing the entire ship. And to make the matter worse, it seems like the mechanism that is used to deattach the wings were just small explosives. So as if flying around in a not-so-aerodynamic starfighter that doesn't have any shields, that also doesn't have adequate life support, isn't dangerous enough, now you're going to put explosives in the wings. The TIE Fighter had to fit a multi-purpose role. It wasn't just a war machine, it also had to deal with peacekeeping operations. This meant anti-smuggling patrols and pulling over suspicious ships. The problem is almost every starship in the Star Wars galaxy has a hyperdrive. And because the TIE Fighter also didn't have a tractor beam, it meant getting away from the Empire was as easy as jumping into hyperspace. Just think about how many rebels, pirates, and criminals got away from the Empire because the TIE Fighter didn't have a hyperdrive. Perhaps there was enough personnel and materials to start a rebellion. The lack of hyperdrive also severely limits the range of a TIE Fighter and makes it over-dependent on the ship that it is stationed on. So let's say a kitchen fire destroys that Gazanti-class cruiser that was your home for the last few months. Well, now you're stuck in space and you're most likely going to run out of air before anyone finds you. And as we explained in our last video about Star Destroyers, because TIE Fighters had to be deployed from the hangar of larger ships once they reverted to real space, it gave enemy fighters time to position themselves in a more advantageous way. Now, the official policy of the Empire was that TIE Fighter pilots and TIE Fighters were expendable. But that doesn't necessarily mean that TIE Fighters were unskilled. As a matter of fact, most of the time they outclassed their Rebel counterparts in both skill and training. You see, only the smartest, most talented individuals in the Imperial Navy actually were sent to flight school and then assigned as fighter pilots. We did an entire video that goes through what it takes to be an Imperial pilot. You can check it out here. And it's definitely not only extremely difficult, but it's also a time-consuming and expensive process. The Empire invested a lot of resources to find and train the right candidates. And these TIE fighter pilots weren't just pilots, they were accomplished mechanics, engineers, problem solvers, and leaders. Most of them were mechanically capable enough to strip down their entire TIE fighter and then rebuild it. So why spend that much time and energy training pilots if you're gonna just end up putting them inside of a flying coffin? Seems like a really stupid move. Limited by its design, TIE fighters were mainly used as a defensive layer around capital ships. Because of their lack of hyperdrives and long-range weapons, this often meant by the time they were able to engage and intercept enemy ships, they were already relatively close to their own carrier ships. Usually this meant the enemy was already within striking range of Imperial capital ships with proton torpedoes and ion torpedoes. Ideally, the TIE fighters should really intercept enemy ships way before they get within range of Imperial capital ships. On top of that, with the TIE fighters engaging in dogfights so close to their own ships, they effectively screen their own gunners from using their guns to attack enemy starships. This whole defensive strategy is really stupid. If you think about it, the TIE fighters are filling in the role that point defense weapons should have, and as we discussed before, Star Destroyers for some reason don't have point defense weapons. The Star Destroyers are much better off having smaller laser cannons on the whole rather than having dozens of starships randomly swarming across their gunners' firing lanes. Right after the rise of the New Order, the TIE fighter was introduced, and for the most part, it was kind of adequate at its job. When it came to combat, it holds its own quite well against Clone War era fighters and civilian ships. Of course, as we mentioned before, a lack of hyperdrive made it very easy to escape from a TIE fighter, but generally it wasn't a terrible design. But as the rebellion began to grow in size and their ships became more advanced, the TIE fighters quickly became outgunned and outclassed in almost every way. The TIE fighter was not only no longer able to compete, it was becoming a liability for the Empire. I'd go as far to say that had more advanced fighters like the TIE Interceptor been stationed on the Death Star, maybe the destruction of the Death Star could have been prevented. By the time the Battle of Yavin had started, the TIE fighter was already 19 years old. It's kind of ironic that the mighty Empire was flying 2-decade-old fighters, while the Ragtag Rebellion actually had the latest and most modern fighters in the galaxy. The TIE fighter really reminds me of the story of the Mitsubishi Zero, one of the premier fighters in the Pacific Theater during World War II. Limited by engine technology and economic sanctions, the Japanese designer Jiro Horikoshi faced many problems when designing the Zero. He decided to limit the weight of the aircraft to such an extreme length that it actually became more maneuverable and advanced than any other fighter at the time. But this was all at the expense of protection. The cockpit lacked any real armor for the pilot, and the plane didn't even have a self-sealing fuel tank. The Zero, like the TIE fighter, was a flying coffin that oftentimes erupted in flames. But at least in the beginning of the war, the Zero had an excellent kill-to-death ratio, around 12-1. But as the war advanced, the Allied powers introduced more powerful and heavier aircraft that were able to match the Zero and eventually surpass it. This story is a reminder that combat and technology is fluid, and if you don't innovate, if you don't advance your own designs, you're gonna fall behind. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed our analysis of the TIE fighter and its many flaws. We're going to take a pause on this series for an episode or two, but we will continue it in the near future. Let me hear your suggestions on what you guys think we should tackle. We haven't really done anything outside of the Empire in the last 3 episodes, so maybe we'll do something from the Republic or something. Who knows? Well guys, don't forget to subscribe, hit that notification button so you don't miss out on the rest of our awesome content. And as usual, thanks for joining us today. If you're watching this, you are Generation Tech.